our weekly podcast filled with Torah and thoughts, ideas, poetry, music, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So glad that you are here joining us. This is Rabbi David, and in this episode I'm going to focus in a bit on some questions that are really in the public sphere right now. How do we remember our history? Which history? Who decides? And that question comes right out of this week's Torah portion in a very intriguing and very interesting way. So before we dig in, I'm going to throw a little music at you. Speaking of history, this is the 50th anniversary of the Grateful Dead's great album, Working Man's Dead. And I thought we'd begin with Uncle John's Band.
Well, the first days are the hardest days, don't you worry anymore. 'Cause when life looks like easy street, there is danger at your door. Think this through with me, let me know your mind. Whoa, what I want to know is, are you kind? It's a buck dancer's choice, my friends, better take my advice. You know all the rules by now, and the fire from the ice. Will you come with me? Won't you come with me? Whoa, what I want to know, will you come with me? Goddamn, will I declare, have you seen the light? Their walls are built of cannonballs, their motto is don't tread on me. Come here, Uncle John's band, playing to the tide. Come with me or go alone, he's come to take his children home. Same story the crow told me, it's the only one you know. Like the morning sun you come, and like the wind you go. Ain't no time to hate, barely time to wait. Whoa, what I want to know, where does the time go? I live in a silver mine, and I call it Beggar's Tomb. I got me a violin, and I beg you call the tune. Anybody's choice, I can hear your voice. Whoa, what I want to know, how does the song go? Come here, Uncle John's band, by the riverside. Got some things to talk about here beside the rising tide. Come here, Uncle John's band, playing to the tide. Come on along and go alone, he's come to take his children home. some things to talk about. Here beside the rising tide. Come hear Uncle John's band playing to the tide. Come on along and go alone. He's come to take his children home.
Ain't no time to hate, barely time to wait. How does the song go? I want to suggest that that very same issue arises for us in Parashat Dvarim, the very first portion in the book of Deuteronomy, the fifth of the Torah's 5 books. And I want to dig into that question with you right now. Deuteronomy is built around a series of speeches that Moses gives to the Israelites. The Israelites are still on the other side of the Jordan, across from Jericho. They've not yet entered the land. And Moses wants to tell them their story, remind them of the law, get a few things straight with them before they make that crossing into Eretz Yisrael. His telling or retelling of the Israelites' history, it turns out, is not always consistent with versions of that history that we know of from earlier parts of the Torah. He tells a number of stories very differently from the way that they appear earlier on. As one scholar writes, one might expect the rehashing of the desert story to match the original, but lo and behold, it doesn't. That scholar, whose name is Zev Farber, actually provides a list of 10 examples in the early chapters of Deuteronomy where Moses' retelling is dramatically different from the earlier version, the version of what he calls the original. And one of those instances, one of those examples, is in the retelling of the story of the spies, the scouts who are sent to check out the land of Israel. I want to share with you just a couple of the verses from the Deuteronomy version, in which Moses says to the people, "All of you came to me and said, Nishlacha anashim lefanenu, v'yachparu lanu et haaretz." Let us send men ahead to reconnoiter the land for us and bring back word on the route we shall follow and the cities we shall come to. And then Moses says to them, Vayitav be'enai hadavar. I approved of the plan. In the book of Numbers, Parshat Shlach Lecha, Numbers chapter 13, the story is told in the following way. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God said to Moses, Shlach lecha anashim, vayaturu et eretz Canaan. Send men to scout the land of Canaan. God to Moses, send men to scout the land of Canaan. Jacob Milgram, great Bible scholar, in his commentary on the book of Numbers, writes that the Deuteronomy version actually constitutes a breach of faith on the part of the people and on the part of Moses, because God had already scouted the land. Since Moses approved of the expedition, he too was condemned, along with the people, to die in the desert. Traditional commentators try to resolve these inconsistencies by harmonizing, by suggesting that the two different versions are actually all parts of the same story, and if you put the pieces together in the right order, you'll get the whole story, or the real story. So Ovadia Sforno, 16th century Italian Bible commentator, says here's how the story goes. It starts with the people saying, "Let us choose men and we will send them." But God did not accept this and said to Moses, "You send scouts," meaning you pick the scouts. Don't let the people pick. They're not to be relied upon. contemporary readers, in contrast to Sforno and traditional commentators, recognize that there are two different stories here. And one way of dealing with those two different stories is to try to contextualize them, to, in a way, historicize them. The editors of the Torah Women's Commentary, as an example, share with us that retelling events with new and even conflicting data and perspectives actually illustrates the ongoing nature of interpretation, which is already taking place in the Torah itself. Deuteronomy's retelling of the scout story, they suggest, demonstrates the effect of the experience of exile on the author's self-perception. Whoever wrote Deuteronomy is someone who is already in exile. They're looking back on this particular event, but from a different vantage point, with a different point of view. For the exilic authors, Israel's history is tragically marked by the people's inability to sustain their faith in God. A primary goal, therefore, is to encourage their audience to resist that pattern of not sustaining faith in God, and in contrast, to abide by the covenant. And so when Moses tells this story in this different way from the first version that we've had, there's a reason. He's aiming to really say to the people, his audience, sustain your faith in God. Stick with this covenant. It's going to be worth it. Ellen Frankel, noted scholar, also writing in the Women's Torah Commentary, offers up a psychological reading. She suggests that Moses is engaging in a kind of counter-transference in his interaction with the people, projecting onto them some of his own concerns. She puts into Moses' mouth questions like these. What has happened to this people that I led out of slavery? What has happened to our shared resolve? Why have they doomed me to die without enjoying God's presence and God's promise? One more layer to consider. Whether this was originally one story, just with different details in different places, or two different stories that reflected different historical moments and different contexts, or two different stories that reflected two vantage points, two psychologies. It's still the case that the final editors of the Torah, as we have it, the compilers, left both stories here for us. We get to read them both, to compare and contrast, but also to struggle with what it means that there are two different versions of the same set of events. Professor Jeffrey Teague seeks to explore what is underlying the compiler's reluctance to remove the inconsistencies between these two stories. And here's what he has to say. No one version of the past, of a law, of a belief, necessarily preserved the whole truth. No one version is the whole truth. And Teague continues, where the compilers felt unable to decide, they preserved what they received, harmonized inconsistencies as well as they could, and left the rest to posterity. It strikes me that my teacher Jeff Teague's analysis and description is not only an accurate understanding of the Torah and how it came together, of the text that we have in front of us, but is also a beautiful description of one of the great struggles that we're facing in our country and at this moment. The question of monuments, of memorials, of narratives, of counter-narratives, with regard to our own history. Which story do we tell? Which story do we not tell? What happens when two different narratives really and even dramatically contradict one another or are inconsistent with one another? How do we understand those inconsistencies? How do we grapple with them? How do we account for different perspectives, different moments in history, different points of view in the telling of essential stories, essential narratives that are fundamental parts of who we are as a people, of who we are as a country? Before digging further into that question, I thought I'd bring you a little bit more music. Achinoam Nini, the great Israeli singer, works off of a poem written by Leah Goldberg, the great Israeli poet of the middle of the 20th century. And the poem describes having actually come from two different places, having roots in two different landscapes and in two different points of view. What it means to live with those two perspectives within oneself. Enjoy. We'll talk more on the other side.
צלצול המחטים היה אקרא מונדת למרחב השלג לקרח ירקרק כובל הפלג ללשון השיר בארץ נוכריה. Well, I remember those snow-capped mountains and a song on FM 93. Oh, my darling, I have grown with you, but my roots on both sides of the sea. אולי רק ציפורים מסע יודעות כשהן תלויות בין ארץ לשמיים את זה הכאב של שתי המולדות. איתכם אני נשתלתי במים, איתכם אני צמחתי אורנית ושורשיי בשני נופים שונים
So let's think about Confederate monuments for a minute. In a remarkable essay in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, poet Carolyn Randall Williams described herself as a Confederate monument. The reason for that claim is that her family line includes both white and black Southerners. And she, in her body, is evidence of some of the crimes of slavery, rape among them. She asks some really important questions about what a monument even is. What is it, she writes, but a standing memory, an artifact to make tangible the truth of the past? And ultimately, it is her claim that removing Confederate monuments is not an act of rewriting history. It's actually an effort to reframe the past. It's not a matter of airbrushing history, she says, but of adding a new perspective. I find her claim really fascinating and also very much in line with Professor Tigay's thought about why the compilers of the Torah leave in place two contradictory stories about the same set of events. It may be that the right thing for us to do in our time and in our place is to make sure that wherever there is a Confederate monument, there's another monument that tells another part of the story, that offers up another perspective. It may also be the case that really the right thing to do is to remove that monument so that we can tell the story again, reframe it in a healthier way, in a way that is more inclusive, in a way that captures much more of the truth of our past. The debate, for sure, will continue for some time, but I wanted to offer just a bit of perspective on it by focusing on this week's Torah portion and the way in which it tells and retells key stories, key parts of the narrative of our people from different perspectives, from different point of views, reflecting different aspects of the truth. Thank you so much for being here, for being part of this conversation. Look forward to hearing from you and to being together with you on an upcoming podcast. But one more piece of music before we let you go away. Joni Mitchell's classic, Both Sides Now, which speaks to exactly that question of multiple perspectives on the very same thing. Enjoy.
Rows and flows of angel hair and ice cream castles in the air and feather canyons everywhere. I've looked at clouds that way, but now they only block the sun. They rain and snow on everyone. So many things I would have done, but clouds got in my way. I've looked at clouds from both sides now, from up and down, and still somehow it's cloud illusions I recall. I really don't know clouds at all. looked at love that way, but now it's just another show. You leave 'em laughing when you go, and if you care, don't let them know. Don't give yourself away. I've looked at love from both sides now, from give and take, and still somehow it's love's illusions I recall. I really don't know love at all. Tears and fears and feeling proud to say I love you right out loud. Dreams and schemes and circus crowds, I've looked at life that way. But now old friends are acting strange. They shake their heads, they say I've changed. Well, something's lost, but something's gained in living every day. I've looked at life from both sides now, from win and lose, and still somehow it's life's illusions I recall. I really don't know life at all. I've looked at life from both sides now, from up and down, and still